Thank you so much for that kind introduction and warm welcome. I want to appreciate Provost Carver and her staff for organizing this wonderful institute. I hope you've had a good one so far in the morning. I'm very grateful for this invitation to come to Tulsa and share some of my work with all of you today. So the title of my talk is From Michael Brown to STEM Education, Race and Racism in Classrooms. Almost 5 years ago, on August 9, 2014, teenager Michael Brown was shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. Since then, among so many other police killings of black people around the country, we've seen the rise of various forms of activism, including the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I think this might seem like a somewhat unusual place to start a talk about STEM education, but this is what I want to engage you all in thinking about today. I think what happened to Michael Brown, and what happens to many of people of color in this country, is related to how race and racism are operating in our STEM classrooms. I know many of the people in this room are already doing anti-racist work in higher education as well as in K-12. And even though racial equity work in education is a difficult burden, I do believe that through a deeper understanding of racialization, we can make life better for our students of color. My hope is that you're going to come away from this talk with a new way of thinking about how race and racism matter in STEM education. And hopefully that can inform your ongoing efforts at your own institutions. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my own sort of unusual path into STEM education research. Many years ago, I was an undergraduate in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was working on degrees in business and in computer science. And I thought I was going to move to Silicon Valley and start my own tech company. That's what I thought was going to happen. But after spending some time working in the West Philly schools, I got a chance to see racial inequity close up. And because of that experience, I decided to leave that behind and become an educator. One of the things that my students in Michigan State, I think, often get surprised by is when I tell them that I actually never wanted to be a high school math teacher. I really wanted to be a high school English teacher because my passions are in literature and film and so on. But I decided to go into math education in part because I had come to see math as a gatekeeper into college for racially minoritized students. And then later I was inspired by the work of people like Bob Moses, who for decades have argued that access to math and STEM education can be thought of as racial justice issues akin to civil rights. I taught in California at a place called Richmond High School. Some of you might be familiar with this school because kind of in a surreal way, while I was teaching there about a decade ago, they made a movie about the school with Samuel L. Jackson called Coach Carter. So movies are one thing, right? Real life is another. But I will say that it's a racially diverse and linguistically rich community, but at the same time highly economically marginalized. So there wasn't a whole lot of support for teachers, administrators, and certainly not for the students either. But I really enjoyed that work, and eventually I came to serve as department chair. And a focus of mine in that role was to try to break down tracking structures, right? They're preventing so many of our students of color from getting access to higher level mathematics courses like AP Calculus. Right? So that was really about trying to open up that K-12 pipeline into STEM, and not only up until high school, but also beyond into college. Now, when I left the classroom, my orientation to issues of racial inequity was still largely focused on racial performance gaps in STEM. Now, what's happened since is that my research has led to an evolution and an expansion in how I think race and racism matter in STEM education. So to give you an entry into that, I'm going to start by sharing a story from one of the first studies I ever did about a decade ago. And it involves a time where I met an African-American boy named Will. So I'll tell you a little bit about Will. Will was in the 9th grade. He was in this accelerated geometry class, and he talked about becoming a chemical engineer one day. And he's telling me about his experiences learning math. And then he ends up describing this interaction he has in a math class with another African-American classmate of his. So what's happening is that the teacher is walking around the room passing back tests, right, that were graded. And as usual, Will had done well on the test, so he gets his test back. And his classmate sitting next to him sees Will's good grade on the test. And he turns to him and he says, "Oh, you're hecka smart in math. You must have some Asian." Now this got my head spinning, right, for a few reasons. One, getting a test back and then kids talking about what grades they got, that's something that happens in just about every classroom across the country. That's a really common situation. Why is race coming up in a situation like that? And most people think of mathematics as a culture-free, race-free, kind of neutral space. So why is race coming up in a math class? Right? And on top of that, why is the racial narrative about Asian people coming up in a conversation between two African-American boys? So in this talk, my goal is to convey two simple, but what I think are powerful ideas building on these kinds of questions. The first is that race and STEM education is about more than performance gaps and the K-16 pipeline. And that's been really the dominant way that we tend to talk about race and STEM. I'm going to argue that it's also about what's happening in classroom interaction. Right? One way of thinking about this is that while representation is important, right, it matters that we get students from racially minoritized groups into STEM spaces. Right? But it also matters what happens to them after they get into the classroom, in their racialized interactions with teachers and with their fellow classmates. That, to me, is where the rubber meets the road when we're thinking about race in the context of education. The second idea is that race and STEM education is about more than jobs and college access. Right? That it's also about the humanity and personhood of students of color. Now, one way to work on these things is to hear from students like Will, right? The stories that they tell about their own racialized experiences in STEM spaces. I'm going to take you through a bit of my research where we're going to hear more of those stories today. And after that, I'm going to circle back to Michael Brown's story. And I'm going to talk about how I think it links to what we're seeing with race in STEM education. I also think there are concrete things that every one of us can do to amplify racial equity. And I'm going to close by presenting a classroom observation tool my team has developed to empower instructors to identify racial and other kinds of biases in their classrooms. So a basic assumption in my work has been that STEM learning is not a neutral process. Right? So there were times when I taught that when the bell rang and I closed the door, I thought I could shut out all the messiness of the social and political world. Right? We want to think that that classroom becomes kind of a safe space that blocks out all of the stuff that's hard and oppressive that's circulating in society. And I think that a lot of our teachers feel that way too, especially in subjects, especially in STEM subjects. And I recognize that it's not just about race, right? Gender, class, language, other social markers, these things matter too, even though my work tends to be focused on race. But what the research tells us is that the classroom walls don't function as force fields, right? And what happens in society does end up permeating classrooms as well. So then STEM education is happening in a racial context, but what is that context made of? So we've all heard people say that black people tend to act like this and white people like that. Latinx people tend to be good at these things and not those, and so on and so on. These are all racial narratives, right? Or societal stories about the traits and behaviors of racial groups. Now, usually we think of these as stereotypes, but I like to call them narratives because they aren't just cognitive objects that live in people's heads. Right? These are stories about race that we tell and we retell, and we do that in our social interactions with other people. One reason racial narratives matter is because they shape how people see each other, right? What they think people are capable of. And that ends up having real consequences for people's everyday lives. For this reason, I found that racial narratives is a good way of starting to make sense of how race matters at the level of STEM classroom interaction. So like I said, it's not immediately obvious what race and racism have to do with STEM teaching and learning. I think for a lot of people, it's a lot easier to think about how race might come up in a social studies class or an English class, right, as opposed to a biology class or a physics class or a math class. But race and STEM education do converge. One prominent example of this is the Asians are good at math narrative. Right? Can you just raise your hand if you've heard that before? Okay. So I think one thing that's kind of ironic is just how pervasive this narrative is, despite the fact that math is supposed to be this kind of neutral space. Tomorrow you're going to hear more from Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. And a while back she published a paper titled, What's Race Doing in a Nice Field Like Education? And in my work, I'm kind of riffing on that question and asking, what's race doing in a nice field like STEM education? Right? Like, what is the confluence of these things that don't seem immediately to go together? One clear place for me that they do overlap is this idea of innate intelligence. So, since the modern concept of race was invented in Europe in the 1500s, there's been a long history of false racist narratives about people of color being innately less intelligent than white people. Now this goes back to the writings of Immanuel Kant, right? You'll find it there, David Hume, the early Enlightenment philosophers, all the way up to Ben Franklin, and even modern surveys show that people still today harbor these kinds of perceptions. Now on the STEM side of things, compared with other disciplines, I think what's happened is that STEM has come to symbolize the pinnacle of human intelligence. Right? So when I meet new people, and I tell them that I've been a math teacher or that I have a degree in computer science, I can't tell you how many times one of the first things they tell me is, wow, Niral, you must be really smart. Right? Now this matters because during the Enlightenment, we decided that a prerequisite to full personhood was intelligence, right? Cognitive capacity. So Descartes, right? When he says cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am, right? And right there, cognitive capacity becomes a prerequisite for being a full human being. Now the problem is, to say that some racial groups aren't smart, in part because of racist narratives that they're not good at STEM subjects, it positions them as less than human. Right? And I think in the stories I'm going to share with you, you're going to see a little bit of that in what the students say. So to explore these issues and questions, I'd like to share with you findings from a study where I spent a year in a racially diverse high school in Northern California. Not where I taught, a different school. During the year, I did two things. First, I observed 4 different math classes, and my goal was to try to document explicit and implicit, or kind of more subtle ways that race is coming up in these math classes. And the second thing I did is I interviewed 35 students from these classes. And I intentionally sought a racially diverse group that synced with the racial demographics of the school. So I want to focus today on the interviews that I did. You should know that I told students going into the interviews that I was interested in their general experiences learning math, both that school year and also in the past. They didn't know going in that race was going to be a specific topic in the interviews. The reason why that matters is because what I found is really coming up spontaneously from the students. So halfway through each interview, I asked the students this question. I asked them, have you heard people say that some groups are better than others? Now, even though there's nothing explicitly racial about this question, almost every single student I interviewed, in this study and actually in other studies as well, interpreted this question in racial terms. So what I did across all 35 interviews, I cataloged all of the racial narratives that students invoked as they talked about how they perceive race mattering in math and STEM education. So there's a lot here, and I'm just going to walk you through a few key pieces. So what you're seeing here is a table of all of the different racial narratives that I cataloged. And the way to interpret this, so if you look at this 22 here, for example, so what this 22 means is that in 22 out of the 35 interviews, the students in those interviews mention a racial narrative about Asian people and their intelligence, at least one time during the interview. So if they said it a few different times, I only cataloged it one time. So these are all unique invocations of racial narratives across the 35 interviews. So the first thing I want to point out here is that there was a total of 267 unique invocations of racial narratives across all 35 interviews. That's strong evidence that, at least for the students in this particular study, race was highly relevant to how they thought about being a math member. The second thing I'd like you to notice is that most of the racial narratives do pertain to Asians, and that's consistent with this mythology around the model minority. And that all 35 students reported awareness of the Asians are good at math or STEM narrative. Now, I'll say that across all of these, this isn't indicating whether they personally endorsed those narratives, so meaning like they thought it was true or false. And it's also not getting at the valence of the narrative, so meaning are they talking about Asian intelligence in a good way, or are they talking about it in a bad way, right? Meaning that they're smart or not smart, like that. So I'm going to get a little bit into that piece a little bit later, but this is just showing what they report awareness of. So I want to focus on the Asians are good at math narrative just for a second. I think there are two things that everyone needs to know about this particular narrative. First is that even though this idea is pervasive in the US, it's completely false. There's no empirical evidence that Asians are genetically or culturally predisposed to be good at math. Right? So there's more to say about that. If you have questions about that, we can talk about that a little bit later. The second piece is that even though it seems harmless, right? Like, it's, you know, what could be bad about saying someone's good at something, right? It's in fact not a compliment, right? I'm going to show you why in a second. Some people acknowledge how it can be a source of pressure, like a burden for Asian people to live up to, right? And that's, I think, a part of it. But the other part of it, I think, is that it's racist and it's dehumanizing. So to illustrate that, I want to show you a clip from a show called Family Guy. You may or may not be familiar with this show. It's an adult humor, adult comedy show. It's been around for almost 20 years, which makes it one of the longest TV shows of any kind in U.S. television history. And they do a lot of racial humor. I'm going to show you a clip from it. It doesn't require a whole lot of setup. All you need to know is that this guy here, his name is Peter, and this is his daughter, Meg. And Peter is going to reminisce, and it's a satire, Peter's going to reminisce about the time that he took the SAT.
Right? I'm your supervisor.
Meg, I promise I'll do better at this job than I did on the SATs. Come on. Do math.
Okay, so it's pretty obvious here, I think, how Asian people are being dehumanized, right? All the kids take out calculators from their pocket. When it's Peter's turn, in place of a calculator, he pulls out a human being, right? Clearly an Asian-identified boy. Right? The implication being that this boy is not a full human being, he's actually some kind of android or a human calculator. Right? There's some other things going on. He doesn't get to speak, right, in the clip. Right? And just to sort of reinforce the objectification, she pokes right at the end to cajole him to do mathematics. What I've also been interested in about the Asians are good at math narrative is certainly in what it's doing discursively by itself, but also how it gets linked to other racial narratives. So you'll notice the students cited racial narratives about the math or STEM ability of all the different racial groups at the school. Now, I didn't ask directly about any of these groups. This is what came out spontaneously. I'm guessing that if I had surveyed the students or if I had asked them directly, the numbers for the other groups would have been even higher. And I think what's interesting here is I found that the students didn't talk about all these narratives in isolation. They actually talked about them linked to each other. So 71% of the students I interviewed noted the Asians are good at math narrative in relation with a narrative about another racial group in math, usually positioning that group as mathematically inferior. Now, based on patterns in the data, what you end up with is what Dr. Danny Martin, my colleague at the University of Illinois Chicago, has called the racial hierarchy of mathematical ability, with Asian people being positioned at the top, non-Asians of color at the bottom. In this study, students talked about white students' math ability in sort of kind of in this ambivalent way. Even though in the literature, other studies have shown that people tend to think that white people and Asian people are kind of both positioned at the top of this false hierarchy. Now, I want to be really clear that racial narratives about math or STEM ability aren't true. Right? STEM ability is a human ability. Brilliance in STEM is evenly distributed across the human species. So race does not actually have anything to do with the student's potential in STEM. But racial thinking tries to convince us otherwise. Something else I want to highlight is just the sheer range of topics that these racial narratives were about. Right? So students didn't talk about racial mathematical narratives in isolation, but they connected them to narratives about which racial groups were better parents, smarter, bigger in size, better at sports, and so on and so on. Now, to show how multiple racial narratives converge to position students in math, we're going to listen to three different students. The first is a Tongan student named Isaac. Polynesian people don't often get included in the national conversations about race, but at this particular school, Polynesian students were a small but really significant and kind of high-profile group. So we're actually going to hear, two of the three kids we're going to hear from were identified as Polynesian.
I think just been so big, we don't know to do math. I think we're doing then like some students, I'm not gonna lie, some students like take that image and they prove to them that they are. But me and my brother, a couple of students, we try to prove them wrong. Not that we're only big in sports, but we try to tell them that we're also smart. We're scholar athletes. That's what we try to prove.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but I want you to notice just the range of racial narratives he's invoking. Right? So there's racial narratives about Polynesian body size, which also here might have a gendered aspect. Narratives about their math ability, their intelligence, their athletic ability. And of course, there's also a resistance story here. So Isaac talks about he and his friends think of themselves as scholar athletes. That's an identity at that school that was not typically available to Polynesian children. But Isaac is trying to deploy a counter-narrative, right, about Polynesians' mathematical ability and their general intelligence. Carlos was another student who I worked with that year and also interviewed. He's a 12th grade student who identified as Mexican. And he was in pre-calculus, and he was one of the best students in that class. And what he's going to describe is an experience of bias and how it relates to the kinds of jobs that Mexican people are thought to do.
I've been like biased against because I'm Mexican. You know, I didn't want people to say that about me, like, oh, look, just another Mexican that doesn't know how to do that.
Yeah.
You know? So, you know, that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to do that, was to show people that, you know, Mexicans are smart and they don't just work and party and stuff all the time.
Right.
You know?
So like with Isaac, you can see how a variety of racial narratives are getting entangled, right? About math ability, intelligence again, but this time also about jobs, right? So Carlos notes that Mexican people are stereotyped as being gardeners. Right? What's important there is that this is manual labor and not mental labor. Right? Mental labor is more likely to be associated with intelligence. The implication here is that the narrative about manual labor contributes to the positioning of Mexicans as unintelligent. But that showing others that he's good at math would help Carlos to counter that narrative of intellectual deficit. The last student we're going to hear from is a student named Troy. He's a Samoan student. He was in the same pre-calc class as Carlos, and he's also a well-performing student. What he's going to say syncs with Isaac and Carlos in certain ways, but for Troy, being big in physical size also has implications for him being seen as a violent threat.
You know me just seem a big, mean, and like here, like poly kids, we're seen as like, you know, big, we do whatever we want, kind of. That's what they think. Like that's what a lot of people think about. It's like we do whatever we want. Like we're not that very intellectual, and like we're not you're not smart, basically.
Right.
Well, like once they meet me, like they'll know, like I'm actually very intelligent, and I can I can do math. I know how to do math. I know how to do English. I know how to do science, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then I think that's why they just come in and they see me as like someone's gonna hurt them or like beat them up or
Right.
someone's gonna freaking just like want to kill, basically.
Right.
Instead, like they're not gonna take time in their own hands to actually sit and talk with me and actually greet me or actually get to know me.
So what stands out to me here is how Troy pits being big in size and perceived as threatening explicitly against being seen as smart and as good at math. Right? I hope you can hear the pain in Troy's voice that other students aren't really seeing him for who he really is. The racial narratives about Polynesians, and perhaps specifically Polynesian men and boys, distort what people see. And this brings me back to Michael Brown. So I want to ask this question. How did Darren Wilson see Michael Brown in the moments before he killed him? And how does that relate to what I've shared about racialization in STEM education? So Darren Wilson gave testimony to a grand jury where he recounted his version of what happened that day between him and Michael Brown. I pulled a couple of excerpts from that testimony that I'd like us to recall and think about. So you might remember from that incident initially, Wilson was in his police car, right? And Michael Brown was outside the car, and then their altercation began. Now, in reflecting on that part of the confrontation, Wilson said this: "When I grabbed him, the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan, the wrestler. And that's just how big he felt, and how small I felt just from grasping his arm." And then there's what happens after Wilson gets out of the car, just before he shoots and kills Michael Brown. He says, at this point, it looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots, like it was making him mad that I'm shooting him. Now, I'll say that to me, based on these comments, in those final moments, Wilson saw Michael Brown as more an enraged, hulking animal than as a human being. Obviously, Wilson is knowingly or unknowingly tapping into various racist narratives about black people and black men and boys in particular. The comment about Michael Brown's relative size is interesting, given that both men were actually the exact same height. They were both 6'4", and both were over 200 pounds, so they were big men, even though Michael Brown had about 60 pounds on Wilson. And it reminds me of what Troy said, how people's racialized perceptions of his body and his temperament distorted who he really was. I think he, Carlos, and Isaac were all getting at this issue of how they were dehumanized, as racial narratives put a spotlight on their physical bodies at the expense of their intellectual capacity. And here's what I'm wondering. What if the dominant racial narratives in circulation position black people as intellectually brilliant, which is what they are? Would that have affected Wilson's perception of Michael Brown? Would he have been less afraid of him? And because of that, would Michael Brown still be alive today? And these are really broader questions about the positioning of people of color in the United States as often targeted members of society. Now, obviously, we can't know the answers to these questions. But given what the research is telling us about how STEM education gets implicated in racial narratives about intelligence, I believe STEM educators have a responsibility to actively shift these narratives. Now, STEM isn't the only place where certain racial groups get positioned as unintelligent, but it does contribute to the broader cultural discourse of race. The racialization that takes place in STEM is linked to the racialization that takes place in society. So what can we do about this? Now, in my study, I didn't just talk to students about the racial narratives they're aware of. I also wanted to know where they saw those racial narratives coming up in their classes. Right? What parts of the classroom activity were they seeing these racial narratives? Now, there were several of these places where students saw these narratives influencing classroom interaction, but one of the biggest ones is whole class discussions. So students reported that they noticed racial patterns in who's participating and who's not, who's getting called on and who's not. And they were noticing these patterns even when nothing racial was said. Dr. Deborah Ball at the University of Michigan has talked about teaching being dense with what she calls discretionary spaces, where how teachers exercise their judgment about their students and what's happening in their classrooms ends up having profound implications for equity and inequity. I see whole class discussions as a type of discretionary space. Now, you all probably have been in this kind of situation if you've had to manage a whole class discussion with a lot of people in the room. But when teachers look out at their students and they're orchestrating a discussion, they have a lot of complex decisions to make in rapid succession. Right? They have to decide who to call. They have to decide what they're going to ask them to do. They're going to have to figure out how does calling on this student as opposed to that student, how does that advance or impede the goals of the lesson, and so on and so on. Now, that's a tremendously cognitively complex task. And that's what makes it ripe for implicit bias. Right? It's not as if explicit bias has gone away, but about 20 years of social psych research tells us that we all, despite our best intentions, have these kind of implicit cognitions that below the level of our conscious awareness guide how we think about people and what we do in the world. And I think this is interesting in the case of teachers because I think teachers are some of the most compassionate and well-intentioned people that you'll find. But at the same time, they're still human beings. Right? And because of that, teachers might inadvertently privilege the participation of students who look like them, who talk like them, right? And who produce knowledge like them. The act of distributing participation opportunities in whole class discussions is something where teachers can both do a lot of harm, but if they do it right, they also can do a lot of good. Something else I think that's really important here is that why all this matters goes beyond just traditional content learning. So I argue when students participate or don't in public settings like whole class discussions, their classmates are also learning about the domain competence of those students' social identity groups. Right? So it's not just about the individual students, it's also about the groups too. So when they only see certain racial groups participating and not others, right? Narratives about the mathability of those groups get relearned. And for students from historically marginalized groups in particular, it's critical, I think, that they're seen publicly as competent participants. Now, right now, the pressing problem is that teachers don't have tools to help them monitor the material impact of their implicit biases in everyday classroom interaction. And responding to that need, last year, my team launched a free, customizable observation tool called Equip, which stands for Equity Quantified in Participation. The website is equip.ninja. Why ninja? Well, we found that .com is less memorable than ninja, so people seem to remember equip.ninja. So Equip comes out of a collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Dan Reinholz at San Diego State University. And the idea behind it is that it generates quantitative analytics on participation patterns and the distribution of participation opportunities. The quantitative approach we take in Equip is intended to complement qualitative analyses of equity and inequity. For example, interviews with students about their subjective experiences in classrooms. Now, the basic idea is to focus on capturing not everything, but the low-hanging fruit, right? The stuff that's lower inference and thus a little bit easier to capture without doing a kind of a full research project, but also high leverage in terms of changing practice for the better. So the goal isn't, again, to capture everything about equity and inequity, but enough that you get some kind of baseline on analyzing practice. So here's some of the kinds of questions that Equip is designed to answer. And the tool is fully customizable, so teachers and also researchers can adapt Equip based on their local settings and what's of interest to them in those local settings. Many teachers that we work with and that have been using Equip are curious about potential racial biases, but we've also had teachers track patterns based on less common demographic markers like religious status and popularity. So for example, one teacher I worked with in Michigan, he works at a Catholic school, a private Catholic school, and we were discussing, how he wanted to use Equip in his classroom this past school year. And one thing I asked him the question, I said, well, why don't you think about where marginalization might be happening at the school? And one of the things he realized was that there's sort of this hierarchy between Catholic and non-Catholic students. That at his particular school, teachers at the school, other students, felt that non-Catholic students were less prepared for academic work than Catholic students. And so he configured Equip to focus on religious status, for example. So basically what Equip is doing is asking a who question. So there might be great things going on in the classroom, but the question is, who's getting access to those things? Right? Is it just members from dominant groups, or is it everybody? And Equip is complementing other tools, like, for example, the equity scorecard, which I know at TCC you all have been engaged with. But one difference is that it's disaggregating at the level of classroom interaction, so a much finer grain sense. Equip has a range of different data visualizations that reveal different things about what's happening in the classroom. Here's just a sampling. So in the upper left, you can see it breaks down participation by demographics. On the upper right, it allows you to track changes in participation patterns over time. And that's really important because the whole premise behind Equip is that teachers can get better at teaching for equity, right? By monitoring their biases over time, they actually can attenuate the impact of those biases. You want to have a way to track that. And at the bottom here, Equip is showing that also can track data on individual students, right? So if you have particular curiosities, questions about the participation of individual students, this representation, this heat map representation, is one way that it shows that in Equip. So I'm going to be giving a full demo on the tool during the workshop, so if you're interested, feel free to stay for that. Now, we launched publicly about 9 months ago, and we've seen some pretty nice uptake so far in a short period of time. This covers higher ed institutions who have started using Equip, K-12 school districts, and also researchers. We think as more people continue to use Equip, this is just going to grow, and we're finding that kind of the best marketing is word of mouth. Like once you actually use it and see the value, that's when we're finding people share it with their colleagues. So I'm going to briefly share with you some findings from a couple of recent studies we've done across K-16 using Equip. The first study was of an elementary math program, and it was taught by a highly experienced, veteran, equity-minded teacher, pseudonym Miss J. Now, I'll just say that Miss J is pretty much one of the best math teachers I've ever seen in my life. There were 30 students in the class. The gender split, based on gender binary, was 50-50. And the class was mostly black, although there were also white and Latinx students in the class. Now, in the Equip work, when we do this for research, our unit of analysis is what we call a participation sequence. And all that is if you're following a whole class discussion, a new sequence starts every time a new kid talks. So let's say I'm the student, you're the teacher. You might have like a 12 or 13 turn exchange just with one student, right? You might ask multiple questions and so on. All of that gets coded as one sequence. But then a new student might speak, but they might just have one turn. That's also one sequence. And so that's what a participation sequence is. So in this study, we coded over 1,000 participation sequences, and we were looking for patterns based on race and gender. So I just want to start with the individual student graphs. So this histogram shows a blue bar for each of the 30 kids in the class, and I've removed the names here of the kids. And this is just showing the raw number of times students participated. The orange line just above 40, that's the average number of participation sequences per student in this class. Now you can see that on the right, there are a couple of students who are dominating class discussions, and on the left, there are some students who barely participate at all. Now this simple graph, what we found in people using Equip so far, is that teachers get a lot of mileage out of this because it gives them sort of a quick, instant snapshot of patterns of marginalization and domination that they can kind of think more about and reflect on. Let's take a look at one of the graphs now disaggregated by gender. So what this graph is showing is teacher questions, the types of teacher questions, and how it broke down by gender. So what this y-axis represents is a metric that we call the equity ratio. And how you can think about that is it's actual participation divided by expected participation based on demographics. So for example, if 40% of this class, well in this case it was 50% was girls, if girls actually got, let's say 60% of all of the Y-level questions, 60 divided by 50, the equity ratio would be 1.2. So really what it's measuring is disproportionality. So this line here, where the equity ratio is at 1, that would be a proportional distribution of participation opportunities. So one thing you can kind of see here is that the orange bars for girls, they're all really close to the equity ratio line of 1. And so we can say that participation opportunities to teacher questions were proportional for girls. One thing to note here is that that's not necessarily the same as equity, right? So it's equal, right? It's equally distributed. But we know that equity and equality are also distinct things, right? So that's another kind of conversation that teachers can kind of start making sense of. But I will say that across 1,300 participation sequences, the fact that things were disproportionate, especially for girls that historically marginalized group in STEM, I think is pretty remarkable for this teacher. What you're seeing here is the exact same thing, but now for race. There's a couple of things I want to point out here. Things that are a little more complicated. So let's look at the blue bars first. These are black students in the class. And you're going to notice that the distribution of questions of different types was either proportional or even slightly greater, right, across the board for black students. And that's a positive sign, given what we know about how black students tend to be treated in math classrooms. However, if you look at the orange bars for Latinx students, you see the exact opposite pattern, and that's a problem. With white students, you'll notice that they receive disproportionately fewer how and what questions, which are kind of we would classify as more kind of lower level questions, but just disproportionately more why questions, right? Which are the questions where they're getting asked to explain their thinking and justify their mathematical reasoning. The last kind of analysis I want to show you in this class is an intersectional analysis. So here we're switching gears from teacher question to the student side of things. So this is student talk, okay? The type of student talk and the length. So there's a lot going on here, but I just want to point out a couple of things. First, I want you to notice the green bars. These are white boys in this classroom. And you'll notice that they were disproportionately overrepresented with Y-level talk, and also with the longest contributions. Now, if you cross-reference this with that first graph we saw, the individual student histogram, it turns out that there was one white boy in the class who at times dominated the conversational floor. And you're seeing Equip kind of pick that up here. The second thing to notice are the gray and the yellow bars, right, for Latinx boys and for girls. Now, nearly all of them are under this proportional line, but the yellow bars for Latinx girls are well under it, and in some cases are missing altogether, right, like with extended contributions of 21 or more words. Now, one kind of big takeaway with the Equip work for us is that Equip is painting a complex picture of what's happening about both equity and inequity. So what we find is when teachers do this, it's very rare that you see one classroom that is entirely equitable, however you define that, or entirely inequitable. Usually it's somewhere in between. It's always kind of a mixed bag. And I think with this teacher's classroom, if inequities are appearing in this teacher's classroom, a veteran teacher, really committed to equity, I think this is something that all teachers need to be actively monitoring. I also want to be clear that this isn't about identifying sexist teachers, racist teachers, this kind of thing, right? Implicit biases are something that we all harbor, right? Even if we're members of those groups, right? That's what the research tells us. So Miss J might have an implicit bias against Latinx students, for example, or Latinx girls in particular. But there also might be good pedagogical reasons for these patterns coming up. And that's why we tell teachers that the numbers don't speak for themselves, right? It's just a bunch of numbers. What they need to do is put the numbers in conversation with their professional judgment, and also their own knowledge about their students. So the last study I want to share with you is one we did at that sort of opposite end. So going from elementary, this is a college-level math class. Here we focused on gender. And we also expanded from just looking at whole class discussions, we also looked at group work in this study. And we also looked at something called side talk. Right? So there's a whole class discussion going on. Sometimes students will turn to each other and kind of comment on what is being discussed. Right? So one of the things we found is that when you look at group work and side talk, women's participation was proportional. And when you look at the quality of that talk, right, it shows that they really knew the math. Right? So there's a lot of mathematical brilliance amongst the women in this class. But when you look at the analysis of the whole class, it was 90-10 dominated by men. And we titled this paper Hidden Competence because in the small group, all of that mathematical brilliance and knowledge, the women might be doing great in the class, they're participating in small groups, but in public, that brilliance isn't making its way so that everyone else in the class can see that, especially people from dominant groups. right, that might buy into sexist narratives about women in STEM. The other thing we did a little bit of qualitative analysis in the groups, and what we found was that there were multiple instances of gender microaggressions and also sometimes overtly sexist interactions, right? And so we speculated that, we didn't have a chance to interview the women in this class, but we speculated that it could be that they didn't feel comfortable because of those kinds of interactions putting themselves out there in the public space, right? And what that might mean for how they position through sexist comments, for example. The next steps for us with this work, we're doing two things. One is we're starting to study how teachers are making sense of analytics like these, how they reflect on them, and then actually how they utilize them to change practice, right? Because just because you have the data doesn't mean that suddenly it's going to result in equity, right? There's a few more steps in there that need to be in place. So we're starting to study that. The other thing we're doing is that a lot of people who use Equip are interested in group work, specific analytics. So we're in the middle of developing this as well. Now, I just want to say that teaching for equity is very hard work. This is a massive understatement. As a former teacher myself and current college professor, this is something obviously that I care deeply about, and I don't always get it right? But I don't think this is about making teachers feel bad or guilty. I think it's about empowering teachers to make equity central to their teaching practice. So to summarize, I think a question for all STEM educators to ask themselves is, what are my students really learning? And we set out to teach them things like how to solve equations and the structure of a cell and so on. But what I realized is that alongside traditional content learning, students also are learning about social markers like race. Right? Every time they're in a classroom, often without consciously realizing it, they learn which racial groups are smart and which are not, which are deemed to care about school and which are not. Right? As teachers, that's something that has to be on our radar as well, alongside the usual focus on academic content. So with that in mind, I'm going to just circle back to the two key takeaways that I started the talk with. One, while maintaining a focus on getting racially minoritized students into the pipeline, we also need to be looking for race and racism in everyday classroom interaction. And two, we can benefit from a broader framing of what STEM education is all about, not just about good-paying jobs and college access. But STEM learning can also be a dehumanizing experience, but I think also if we do it right, it also has the potential to be a space where a student of color can reclaim their humanity. I want to close with 3 concrete actions that institutions can take right now. First is to systematically gather information on students' subjective, racialized experiences in STEM classrooms. I think we're a storytelling species, right? So we can look at numbers and that kind of quantitative data all day long, but I think what really moves the needle are stories, and the stories from the students themselves. The second thing is to actively debunk racial narratives about STEM ability. Now, that could be blatantly positive-seeming narratives, like this Asians are good at math narrative, or overtly pejorative ones. But I think every time we hear these, we can't just let them pass off as jokes or as harmless things. The last piece is to support instructors to identify and reflect on racial and other kinds of biases. That could be with a tool like Equip, but there are probably other ways to do it too. Now, attenuating racism in STEM education is a project that's bigger than one teacher, than one administrator, than one coach. Right? We need everyone participating. And part of our challenge, I think, is to find an entry point into this work for as many people as possible. Thank you.